Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and this is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. We are joined this morning, as always, by my dear friends and teachers, Rabbi Mark Gelman and Rabbi Sherry Hirsch. Good morning, everyone. Nice to have you here.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Nice to see you.
This is Parshat Yitro, and Parshat Yitro, the story right in the middle of the book of Exodus, is the story of revelation. It's the story when the Jewish people arrive at Mount Sinai, and according to the Torah's understanding, they meet God. But before we can do that, there is an episode at the very beginning, which I think is very apropos for this moment in our collective history. Moses is met by his father-in-law, Jethro. Jethro, Yitro, of course, is the chieftain of the Midianite tribe where Moses lived for so many years and married Jethro's daughter, Tzipporah. And Jethro looks into the eyes of his son-in-law and sees that he's exhausted. Moses, exhausted. Now, that's an image that we don't often hold close in the Torah. And what's so interesting is what exhausts him? It wasn't the battle with Pharaoh over the fate of this people. It wasn't bringing the plagues to destroy Egypt. It wasn't the journey out of Egypt. It wasn't crossing the Red Sea. What exhausts Moses is leading this people, the Israelite people, the Jewish people, because every one of them has a problem, and every one of them has a kvetch, and every one of them has something, and they all come to Moses. And Moses, who of course was trained as a shepherd, thinks that it's his responsibility to respond to every one of these issues. And Jethro looks at him and says, no, my son, there's a better way, and initiates a system of leadership. Now, let's begin with this idea of the leader who is exhausted by the burdens of leadership, the leader who's exhausted by the complaining of a people, the leader who is exhausted because he can't seem to convey a message that we're in this together. What do we learn from this conversation between Jethro and Moses at the beginning of the Torah? Rabbi Gelman, you want to begin?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think we learn a lesson that changes our lives if we're willing to learn it. And that lesson is that what we do matters to someone. There's a wonderful story by Loren Eiseley in his book, The Star Thrower, about a man who's walking on the beach and he sees an old man up ahead of him on the beach throwing starfish into the ocean. And he comes up to him and he says, old man, what are you doing? He says, can't you see I'm throwing starfish back into the water? There was a big storm last night. It washed all these starfish up on the beach. And if I don't get them into the water, when the sun gets hot, it'll dry them out and kill them. And the young man says to the old man, you really are a fool, old man. Don't you understand? Look at this beach. There must be 1,000 starfish more on this beach. You can't get to them before the sun gets high. What you're doing just doesn't matter. And the old man just bent over, grabbed another starfish and threw it into the waves, said to the young man, son, it mattered to that one. It mattered to that one. And I've told that story. It's basically my favorite story many times. And I never thought that the story applied to me. I always thought it applied to others. I think rabbis fall into that trap. They tell stories they think other people will use, but they don't realize the stories they tell are meant for themselves as much as for their congregants. So this week I understood the starfish story for the first time. This is a note, beautiful little note. It says, thank you so much. There's some purple and yellow flowers, and inside it says, I couldn't have managed without you. Now, this card got to me this week, and it had gone back and forth across America. And finally, it was sent to my correct address by the woman who directs the soup kitchen at the Holy Apostle Church in Manhattan on 9th Avenue. And she said, Rabbi Gelman, I'm so glad to find out where you actually live. This letter, this note was purchased by a homeless woman who comes to our soup kitchen every day to get her only hot food. And she wanted you to have this. And it was a beautiful little card. And inside it says, "Dear Rabbi Gelman, every week I look in the garbage to try and find a newsday, and I read your articles in the newsday. And you have been a coach to me for about 30 years. I wish you to have a wonderful holiday. Signed, Valjean Van Snap." So there are days I'm not sure what I do matters. I'm like a lot of people. I do it because I think it might help. I'm throwing starfish into the water because I know it matters to that one, but I don't know for sure. And this week I knew for sure there's a woman who's sleeping in the gutters who sent me a card saying what I do matters. So I'll never ever part with this card. And I want to tell the people who listen to us so kindly, and I particularly want to address this to rabbis who are really burned out. A lot of them are tired, and they don't have contact with the congregations who give them hope, and they aren't able to see them personally or give hugs to people they love in the congregation. And I want you to know that what you're doing matters. And thank you so much. I couldn't have managed without you. There are people in your congregation who would send this card if they had a chance. And to parents whose kids are grumpy and grouchy because they've been basically under house arrest for a year, they mean that too. They mean that they couldn't have gotten through this year without you. So in addition to our well-founded fetches, I want you to know that what you do matters. And if you don't think it matters to everyone, you're right. But it matters to that one. And that's enough.
Thank you, Mark. That was lovely. Thank you. And needed, by the way, by many. Sherry, what does Jethro teach you?
Well, so I just say, Mark, that was so beautiful. And I think many of you know that I do 5 letters every week to carry on a tradition. My mother, every Friday before Shabbat, would sit and write 5 letters to people to acknowledge them. And when she died, I really took it on as a way to carry her legacy. So I encourage everybody, pick 1 letter a week. And I get pretty cards and stickers and all kinds of things, and make it a ritual and send someone acknowledgement, appreciation, because I can see how much it meant to you, Mark. And I'm sure also the writing of it meant a lot to her. So thank you for sharing that. In speaking about Jethro, I am very taken with who delivers to Moshe the instructions for leadership. Now remember, Jethro is his father-in-law. And what he says to him is, this is too much for you to bear. Big issues, let them come to you, but small issues, let them resolve on their own. And so clearly it indicates to us that Moses thought he had to fix everybody's issues. So clearly everybody was bringing everything to Moses, and he was adjudicating on the smallest to the biggest of issues. And Yittro's like, let's sort this out, Moshe. And so I think there's a couple things that are fascinating, and I'm interested to hear what the two of you think. One is this idea that we want other people to fix our problems, and we'll take it, even the smallest problems, to someone else to fix them, is something that Jethro is telling Moses to teach the people. You can solve many of your own problems. Stop looking for external answers. Stop looking for external teachers, and really be intentional about who do you go to for advice. And then the second piece of it is that Moses listens to Jethro, which I think is fascinating, right? It's not his father, it's not his wife, it's his father-in-law. And I love this consciousness of, who do we really take our advice from? because sometimes our spouse is too in it. Like we want their advice, but it's like, what's their agenda? But this idea of who are the people that we really listen to that aren't in our inner sanctum, but are the people that we really can get advice from, listen to it, and put it into action. Because what's so beautiful is that Moses hears this advice and then puts it to work. So clearly Moses could hear Jethro. So that was obviously his influencer, if we're going to use the language of influencers. And then Moses could influence others and say, wait a minute, you need to solve some of these things on your own. Don't go look outside yourself for solutions. Look within you. You have a lot of ability on your own. So there's just there's so much to this puzzle that I want to dissect with you guys, because I just love it. I love this dynamic. And I just want to add, sorry, that my father-in-law was someone that I really took cues from. May he rest in peace. And it was because he was in it, but not totally in it. And we used to talk all the time separately from my husband, just because I really admired him and really wanted his advice. And in some ways, actually not in some ways, in many ways, he was far more of an influencer to me than my own father in many ways. So,
Mark, what are you going to say?
Yeah, just I would add one point more, but that was so beautiful, Sherry, and so true. And I think what you do, your custom, as so many of your customs, is just, it's reflective of the depths of your soul, and it's a sacrifice that you make. It's not a huge sacrifice, but it's a huge contribution to support and love. It's a beautiful thing that you do, really beautiful. And the only thing I would add about Jethro is that he wasn't Jewish. And that's a theme that's come up a lot in our discussions. My belief, because of my friendship with Father Tom, that God didn't give all the truth to Jews. God didn't give all the truth to Jews. I don't see how you can interpret the Jethro story any other way. It's intending to show, without saying it in a kind of heavy-handed way, here's Jethro, a non-Jewish person, a Midianite, who's giving Moses advice that saves his life and saves the Jewish people by establishing a working bureaucracy, actually. And so the idea is God didn't give all the truth to Jews. God gave some of the truth to us, some to others. I think, though there's an element of arrogance and self-servingness in this, I think God gave most of the truth to Jews, but I'm not putting a percentage on it. The point is, there's truth in every tradition, And Jethro's story reminds us of that.
I just want to point out that if you look at this, if you look at the flow of the Torah, we've had a week break here, but the last story in last week's Torah portion was Amalek. That
Yes.
We were coming out of Egypt, and this desert people attacks. And there was an ethic of the desert. If you're going to attack, you attacked from the front where the vanguard was, where the soldiers were. You didn't attack the back where the women and the children and the elderly and the disabled were. You attacked from the front. There's sort of a gentlemanly way of carrying out warfare. And Amalek violates that ethic and attacks from the back. And they become the quintessential symbol of the enemies of the Jewish people. Haman is said to be a descendant of Amalek, and Hitler is every enemy is a descendant of Amalek. So it's very easy to say Amalek is a cipher for all the world outside of our circle. And then you get this Torah portion where you get a corrective to that. And the corrective is a Midianite priest, a Midianite chieftain comes along. He's Moses' father-in-law. He instructs him. He listens carefully. He joins in the worship of the God of Israel. And he shares his wisdom with his son-in-law, wisdom which is quintessential to the task of bringing this people to freedom. So that there's a sort of statement of the Torah of don't close yourself to the outside world. The outside world has something critical to teach you. There are allies in the outside world who share some of your values and share a way of looking at the world that can be so critically important to you. And that, I think, is part of the Jethro. That is one of the functions of the Jethro story here. The other thing, I just find this image of Moses exhausted, because I'm exhausted, because all of us are exhausted, because everyone, every parent in America right now who's stuck at home with kids, I know Sherry has a house full of kids, every parent is exhausted. Every spouse who's trying to love and think of something, is exhausted. The tedium of the isolation and the quarantine of the COVID has weighed on people, and you can feel the exhaustion. Those who are trying to work under these circumstances and keep businesses alive, there's a great deal of that in the culture right now. And the idea that even Moses, the greatest, most self-realized of all human beings, according to the later tradition, even Moses reaches a point where he says, enough, I can't do it anymore. And Yitro comes along and says, all right, Boychik, let's talk about how you're going to fix this. Let's talk, you're doing it wrong. Let's talk about how you're going to fix it. And part of, I think, that one of the implications of what Sherry taught us is, what does Yitro tell him? Yitro tells him, the big stuff you can handle. Fighting Pharaoh, you're good at. Splitting seas, you're good at. Making frogs and hail rain from the sky, you're good at. It's the tedium of the daily routine. It's the tedium of keeping a household running, of keeping a business running, of getting the taxes done, of picking up the garbage. It's the tedium of the daily task that wears on you and weighs on you and removes the spirit from you. And you need some help. You can't do that alone. And that, I love the image of an exhausted Moses, because suddenly I don't feel like I'm quite as alone as I felt yesterday.
Well, and also what you're saying, Eddie, is sometimes when a huge task is in front of us, we can gear ourselves up and handle it. But the monotony of all those little things that rub under our skin is what really tires us out, right? Because we're not preparing for it in the same way. The other thing that you said that I think is really interesting, there's always gaps in the Torah, right? Where there's what was not said, and so you wonder, what was the dialogue between Yitro and Moshe? Did Moses go to Yitro and be like, I'm exhausted? Like, was this the one person he felt like, I'm just done. What do I do? And how do I get help? Or did Yitro say, like, I'm noticing that you look very tired? Like, what was the dynamic between them? And as I mentioned earlier, like, and at what point was Moshe ready to hear the advice? Yeah. Right? Sometimes people give us advice and we're just not ready to hear it. And we're like, okay, thank you, thank you, thank you. But it was like Moses was that worn down that he was like, just tell me what to do, my father-in-law, and then I will do it. So I love the gaps in the Torah too. It's like, I wish I was there to know what was that conversation of asking for help, because I love the image of a great leader, someone who's, quote, got it all together, showing their vulnerability and needing to ask for help. I love that image.
He looks him in the eye and says, I can see something. You look different to me. Mm-hmm. And it's not because you fought Pharaoh, and it's not because you split the sea, but it's the tedium. And on the other side, it's equally true, though. There's a heroism. I have such admiration for moms and dads who are stuck at home with little kids or big kids. And the day-to-day ability to love and to care and to guide and to find ways to entertain those kids and to find ways to engage them and to sit them down in front of computers because they're doing distance learning, online school, the day-to-day tedium of teachers who are going in to teach kids, and with the fear of the COVID, because they're not all of them are vaccinated, but to try to carry on classes with some sense of normality, the tedium of the workers in markets and everything, all of the work that needs to get done, that it's getting done without the accolades. I mean, your beautiful idea of 5 notes a day is just glorious. I teach kids in our school, and we have a little secret conspiracy. I say, I want you to find someone who doesn't often hear a thank you and drop a thank you on them. Just drop a thank you on them. And maintenance staff, pediatricians, supermarket workers, traffic cops have all gotten thank yous from my kids, because I hear from them back. This little kid came up and said thank you, and said the rabbi told me I had to say thank you. I think that's an important, we need each other in that sense.
When
We
you're
really,
total, when you're totally exhausted, Ed, what, who do you go to? Who's your trusted advisors?
Gelman,
Right.
he's
It
no,
And
works both
Gelman,
ways. It works both ways.
I
I,
think
we all have different ways of dealing with exhaustion, right? I'm a guy, I like to retreat. I retreat to my man chair. I don't have a cave anymore, just a chair. I retreat to my man chair. The dog jumps up on my lap. I sit, I open a book. I retreat into a book, and I can find solace and comfort in the structure of a little bit of serious learning. And I do a little bit of learning together. And there's something about feeling like I'm growing a little bit because a new idea comes to me through a great book, through a great piece of literature, a piece of philosophy, gives me back a little bit of control over the world that I've lost control over. That's mine. How about you?
me, Sherry, or Mark.
Mark, where do you go to get rid of the
Oh,
stress?
I sit in my man chair. Well, this is my man room now. We have a new house, so I actually got a room back, but it's basically still a chair. And I I like music and I like high fidelity music. And I I listened yesterday when I was upset about a rabbinic colleague who is also burned out, and I tried to help him. And I don't know if I did. And I turned on Diana Krall, who a great singer, sings ballads, just a very, very thick and luminous voice. And I turned the volume way up, and I just listened to her sing. And the music brought me back. The music brought me back. So music for me, and also, I golf. I love to golf, not because I care what I shoot, and not because I want to beat anyone, but because I like walking outside, and I like seeing the way that nature can be rearranged and still provide the same kind of inspiration that it brings when it's wild. It's one of the great glories of the game of golf and why I love it so much, and it's restorative for me. Those are some of the things I do.
I was going to say that I, like you, Eddie, I retreat into books of ideas. And I sometimes think it's shutting down a little bit or shutting off the world. When I'm feeling motivated, I'll retreat into a book. If I'm feeling lazy, I retreat into binging Netflix. And the other thing I do, which I think is really sort of the key for lifting exhaustion, is I have an executive board of people in my life that are my Yitros, that are close enough that I can get their advice, but I'll actually listen to it, right? They're not people that I'm like, and they're not too close, but I call them my executive board of leadership. And I go to different people in this group of 5 people for different kinds of lifting. And they're my Yitros. Maybe I'm going to start calling them Yitro, the Yitro Club or something. But I do have that because I find that that really enables me to gain perspective and to not drag or dwell over and over on a problem. And it's usually people that don't confirm my rightness or my bias, right? They're people that are like, yeah, there's another way to see it, or there's another way. So it's usually not people that confirm my biases, but it's the same people, and it's been for many years.
Wonderful. So now we have a practical advice from 3 rabbis on how to deal with the tedium and the stress. I want to move forward now into the next chapter of the text of the Torah, because this is really the fulcrum chapter of the entire book of Exodus. The book of Exodus, according to the Jewish tradition, really, it has 11 parshiot. It has 4 at the beginning, which tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. It's Shmot, Bo, Vayera, and Bishalach. And then it has 5 at the end, which will tell the story of the creation of the Mishkan, the first institution, the tabernacle. And the middle 2 parshiot, which is Yitro and Mishpatim, tell the story of the revelation at Mount Sinai. This key event, the people Israel arrive at the holy mountain, And the Torah tells us a story, but it's a real mess. I got to tell you. I mean, there are chapters of the Torah which are exquisitely told as storytelling, exquisitely edited, exquisitely writing. This ain't one of them. Chapter 19, which is such an important story, because this is the story where the people Israel receive a covenantal mandate from God. It's the story of the marriage of Israel and God. Um, and what happens in the story is the chapter is just an editorial mess. You can't quite figure out where is Moses. At one point, he's at the top of the mountain. At one point, he's at the bottom of the mountain. God calls him up to the top of the mountain and says, go back down and tell him not to come too close. And Moses says, I already told him that. It's a real mess, this chapter. And the question, one of the questions that the Mefarshim, that all of us ask is, why is it such a mess? If this chapter is so important, why wouldn't you want this to be told with exquisite clarity? Because the lesson of the story is very powerful. There are lines in this story which echo through all of Jewish existence. You are Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. You are a holy people, a kingdom of priests. You are a people who have a special relationship to the rest of the world and a deep responsibility to carry God into the world. That line is in this Torah portion. I carried you on eagle's wings. That line is in this chapter. And yet the chapter itself is a horrible mess. And I want to suggest that the reason why the chapter is a mess is not by accident. I mean, it could be. I mean, I don't know I wasn't there when they edited it, but it seems to me that a Bible that can be as beautifully told as some of the stories are, and so carefully told, and so delicately told, offers us a chapter like this because there are moments in our lives which are so powerful that the details of the moment get mixed up, that we can't quite remember, where was I? Now, was I there? Was I there? There are moments that so shake up our own memory. The moment is so explosive, so revolutionary, that memory itself is upturned. And that's what's going on in this chapter. This is the chapter in which Israel meets God. Israel meets God. Now, the next chapter, chapter 20, is going to tell the story of the Ten Commandments, and that's told with exquisite clarity. There's nothing ambiguous about it. But this chapter, this moment of meeting, this moment of revelation, this moment of encounter with the divine, is a real jumble of a story. So the question I want to lay on the table now is, okay, so given that it's a jumble of the story, what do we take from it? What do we learn from this? What is the lasting effect of chapter 19 of the book of Exodus? Mark, what do you take from this chapter?
Well, it's the verse that you just alluded to, Al Kanfei Nesharim, on the wings of eagles I brought you to me. And if you ask yourself, what does that mean, on the wings of eagles? It's certainly poetic, but what does it mean? I never knew what it meant until one day the great Nelson Glick, who was my influencer, he dragged me out of the student anti-war movement and brought me to safety in the rabbinate, so I thought. And he was the head of the OSS during World War II in the Middle East. He was a spy for America, and he was a great scholar, found Solomon's copper mines, and he was my teacher, and he brought me into HUC. And one day we were walking in the Judean desert, and he pointed up in the sky and he said, "You see the eagles there?" Frankly, they may have been vultures, I don't know, but they looked like eagles. They might have been eagles. And he said, look carefully. And I looked, and there was an eagle, and then there was a little spot of a something, and I looked, it was a little bird, a little eagle, an eaglet, I guess. And the big bird was swooping down underneath the baby eagle and catching it on her wing, her pinions, feathers, and like a tennis ball wept it up into the air, and it would flap around because it clearly couldn't fly at that point. And he explained the reason this happens is, and this is how they teach their young to fly, because eagles put their nests on rocky escarpments and right at the edge of cliffs. And so when the little eagles are ready to fly, they can't just walk out of the nest. They'll plummet to their death. So what happens is the eagle mother throws them out of the nest, and then they try to fly and they fall. And the eagle mother catches them and moves them up into the sky again to try again. And to me, that image is the most powerful image in the Torah for me of how God leads us and what it means to have faith in God. I talk about that often here, about it, that Judaism is a way to believe in God and express our love and gratitude to God. Well, some people think having faith in God means God does something for you all the time, every minute, all the time. That's not faith. That isn't the way God manages our lives, supports our lives. What happens is there are times in our life when we're falling. We fall. We feel like there's no one who's going to catch us. And then if you have faith, God catches you, sustains you, and puts you back up into the air. And when you think about it, that's exactly how God has directed the fate of the Jewish people throughout history. There are times when the Jewish people fall into misery and oppression and death and pogroms. And where is God? And why isn't God with us now? And there are other times when God catches us and we return to our land and God catches us and we build a great American Jewish community here. And in our own lives, there are times when all of a sudden our despair eases and God catches us. And this is true for the way parents parent their children. You can't support a child every minute of every day. I think that's why children are upset during this time. They need to fly. They need to fly on their own and do what Sherry so beautifully said, to solve things on their own. And so to me, it's the way God cares for us. It's the way parents care for children. And it's the way faith is sustained. During our time of being caught, we say we're grateful. And during the time when we fall, we say, I know I will be caught.
Again, beautiful. Thank you. Sherry, what do you take from this chapter?
Well,
What is this chapter?
what I wanted to touch upon is what you said, which is it's the most unedited, chaotic, like the story that's the centerpiece should be clear and articulate and eloquent, and we should know exactly what happens. But I actually read it a little bit differently than you, Eddie, which is that supposedly each one of us was standing at Sinai, right? Past, present, and future, we all had that moment. And we can all be in one place and have a totally different experience, right? One of my favorite stories is I was doing, this part wasn't the best part, but I was doing the funeral for a man, and I had his 4 boys in front of me and the wife. And each one of them described an entirely different man. And they were arguing in front of me. That's not him. That's not true. That's not true. And I realized that he had entirely different realities with each of these children and even with his wife. And they were all true. And that's what I talked about, that he had very individual relationships. And I think one of the reasons it's so chaotic is that it wants us, the Torah wants us to have our truth of that experience. And if it gave too explicit instructions, we would conform to that. And we would think, well, if it's not my experience, then I opt out. But the chaoticness and the discombobulation allows us to put ourselves in our story and in our truth, and it makes sense to us so that each one of us can claim that moment. So I think there was a real intentionality to the unedited version. And when there's unedited and there's gaps is when you can fill the gaps with you, with your story, your experience. So that's my take on why it's so unedited.
I love that. I think that's very beautiful. I want to suggest just a different kind of reading of this. I found a poem that I really love by the Jewish poet Merrill Feld. And I'll actually read it to you because it's actually worth taking just a quick look at, if it's okay. Um, here's
Eddie's
the
with.
here's the poem. Um, she wrote, "We all stood together. My brother and I were at Sinai. He kept a journal of what he saw, of what he heard, of what it all meant to him. I wish I had such a record of what happened to me there. It seems like every time I want to write it, I can't. I'm always holding a baby, one of my own or one for a friend, always holding a baby, so my hands are never free to write things down. And then as the time passes, the particulars, the hard data of who is there and why slip away from me. And all I have is left with us, the feelings. But the feelings are just sounds, the vowels barking of a mute. My brother is so sure of what he heard. After all, he got a record of it, consonant after consonant. If we remember it together, we could recreate holy time and sparks fly." The idea that we stood at Sinai and we all had different experiences. First of all, men and women had different experiences because we stood at different places at Sinai. And then I got to think that the people standing in the front had a very different experience than those of us schleppers who were stuck in the back. They had a different experience. And then, of course, there's a wonderful midrash from Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer that asks the question, why is the first of the Ten Commandments directed in the second person singular instead of second person plural? And the answer is because every one of us heard a different voice when we stood at Mount Sinai. We all heard a different voice. We all felt that God was talking to me and not to us, but talking directly to me. And what does it mean that we all heard a different voice there? And what I take from the chaos of the chapter is something similar, Cher. I think it's this idea that we all have to find our own Sinai. Been a rabbi for a very long time, and one of the things I learned to do, and I've been doing it too many times this last couple of weeks, is sit with families who have lost a loved one in advance of a funeral and ask them to just tell me stories of their loved one's life. And what happens when you ask them to tell those stories is they begin to uncover the Sinai moments in that life, the moments of revelation. And sometimes there are grand and glorious moments of heroic acts, and often, no, just the way dad put us to bed when we were kids and the trip we all took to Yosemite when we were young. And as we got older, the way he would play with the grandchildren or she would, the way that grandma would cook for us, or the way that grandma would teach us something that we didn't know before. Each of these moments is a revelatory moment. And at the moment when a family's remembering a loved one who has now passed away, those moments are so beautiful and terrific. And I think that what the Torah is telling us is don't look to that Sinai, look to your own Sinai. Find your own moments of revelation when the universe has spoken to you, when God has shouted to you, this is the way of life that matters. This is where you find your own significance and your meaning and your purpose. And listen to your own experiences. Don't keep looking to some desert mountain. It's really interesting to me, by the way, that we would never ever give Jerusalem away as a Jewish people. But in 1979, when Menachem Begin had the chance, he gave away the Sinai, including Mount Sinai. We've never made that a shrine, which is really interesting to me. There's a monastery there, Santa Caterina, which is a spooky place, but we've never made Mount Sinai a shrine, because we've found Mount Sinai in our own experiences. And that's, I think, what the Torah is trying to tell us. So in that vein, I have a closing question I want to ask you, a very deep and spiritual matter. You ready? This weekend, as you well know, is a holy weekend for Americans. This is Super Bowl weekend. There is a football game going to be played tomorrow afternoon between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, led by Tom Brady, reputed to be the greatest of all time, the Moses Maimonides of quarterbacks, and the Kansas City Chiefs, led by a young whippersnapper named Patrick Mahomes, who is quite a genius at what he does. So here's the question. If you've watched the Super Bowl, you well know that the game is only is not the reason to watch. The real reason to watch is the commercials. This year, I looked this up, a 30-second commercial at the Super Bowl cost $5.5 million. That's not the production of the commercial. That's just the broadcast, to get it broadcast. 30 seconds of Gelman, Hirsch and Feinstein would cost $5.5 million to broadcast to the billion people around the planet who would be watching. And there are companies that are going to spend this and more to sell us chips and beer and computer software and God knows what else. So I always ask the kids this question, and I want to ask our spiritual leaders here. If you had 30 seconds to say anything to a billion members of the human race, what would you want to say? If I gave you the 5.5 million, Mark, if I lent you the 5.5 million, Cher, and you had 30 seconds to articulate something to a billion brothers and sisters on the planet, what would you want to say?
I have to jump in here. Eddie, there's a couple companies that have decided not to advertise. I don't know if you've read about this for the Super Bowl this year, and said that their money could be spent better solving the crisis of Corona and the pandemic and bringing people together. So the money that they decided that was devoted to the Super Bowl ads, they've redirected. And that messaging to me is the most powerful. And what they said was, wait, reprioritize this year. Your life is changing. Decide what your values are and make changes. So I'm going to echo what their message was this year. Maybe it's not the quintessential, I mean, stop fighting, I can make peace on earth, I can give my Miss America speech that, you know, every little girl practices with their hairbrush. But really, I just want to take a note from these companies that have said, you know what? Money could be used elsewhere, and we're going to put our money elsewhere. Reprioritize and change how you behave.
Okay. You know what companies they are?
Well, you know what's funny is I would think it's the best advertising moment, but I can't remember which companies they are.
All right, so we'll have to find out the companies. We'll
Yeah, I'll
announce
have to
that
look it
next
up for
week.
you.
Mark, what would you say to the world for 30 seconds?
Well, I'm in a different place here. I would definitely spend the 5.5 million. I was going to buy an ad for the Super Bowl. It just so happened that I just didn't have the 5.5 million. But so that was a flaw in the plan. But if I bought a 30-second, I would say this: my fellow Americans and citizens of the world, you are going to have a chance to get vaccinated at some point in this year. The vaccines you'll be offered are a miracle. They're miracles of modern science. And if you get vaccinated, it's not just going to save your life, but it'll save the lives of others who you might communicate this disease to. Please get vaccinated. Don't waste a miracle.
Very good. Very good. Very good. And
Now, if you
go
got
ahead.
5.5 million, we can do this.
I'm in.
Okay.
Eddie, what would you say?
I don't know. I've thought about it an awful lot. And I think I would simply focus on a child. And I would ask the world to look at that child, maybe look at a collage, a montage of children, and to say, whatever we're going to do, you've got to do it with them in mind, because they're the ones who inherit this planet, and they're the ones that we make our decisions for. But to me, it's a remarkable thing. I mean, so the Torah this week, of course, is about God speaking to the world. So if God took out a 30-second ad at the Super Bowl, what would God want to say? What would God want to say?
Well, I love that so much. And there's something else. Most of these companies don't think this is the one time I'm going to take out an ad. They're thinking every year I'm going to give a 30-second State of the Union. So what would I want to say this year? And what if we imagined, what would God say in the 30-second ad to each of us this moment?
Yeah.
And if God was going to say something next year, what would it be? So it's not a one and done. It's an ongoing revelation, which fits perfectly in with Sinai.
I think so. Well, thank you for joining us tonight. I wish you a good time at the game tomorrow. You can tell us what ads were present and which ones we're missing, and we'll pick that up next week. I want to thank Rabbi Gelman, Rabbi Hirsch for joining me this morning. Remind you that following our Torah study this morning is Shabbos morning service. bar mitzvah of Tomer Tzur is a lovely young man. I was growing up in our synagogue, and enjoy that. And then following that, Rabbi Silverman is with us Rabbi Hillel Silverman is with us for a few words on this week's Parsha. Wonderful wisdom from the Rabbi this evening at 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock or 6:30? 6 o'clock is Minyan, is Havdalah, and evening Minyan with Yossi Dresner, and then Havdalah with Rabbi Hoffman. This week, Minyan tomorrow morning at 8:30, every morning of the week at 7:30, in the evening at 5 o'clock. Lunch and Learn on Wednesday at 12:30. We're learning the book of Job now. And in the evening, one of the closing sessions of our Jewish Life Awakens, Rabbi Jill Jacobs will be our guest this week. I want to thank you. Yeah, I think so. Thank you for joining us. Take very good care. Purim is coming, so get ready to be happy. Thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.